The last time my daughter called me, I missed it by 3 minutes, and I have been measuring my life in those minutes ever since. I remember the exact sound my phone made when I noticed the missed call, a soft chime, polite, almost apologetic. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a mug that still smelled faintly of chamomile tea. The afternoon light was slanted and tired, catching dust in the air like it had something to confess. I wiped my hands on a towel, picked up the phone, and stared at her name on the screen. Lena. 1 missed call. No voicemail. I told myself it was nothing. People miss calls every day. Daughters get busy. Life moves. I pressed call back, listening to the hollow ring that went unanswered, then the calm voice telling me to leave a message. I didn't. I never liked talking to machines. I told myself I'd try again later. Later came and went, so did the next day, then the next week. At first, I called it distance, normal adult distance, the kind everyone says is healthy. Lena was 32, married, working full-time, navigating a world that seemed to demand more from women every year. I had raised her to be independent. I told myself this was the result of good parenting. But good parenting doesn't feel like a door closing without a sound. I'm not the kind of mother who hovered. I didn't read her journals or track her phone. When she moved out, I cried for one night and then learned how to sleep in a quieter house. We spoke every Sunday for years, sometimes about nothing at all. Grocery prices, her husband's habit of leaving cabinet doors open, a neighbor's new dog. Ordinary things that stitched our lives together. So when the calls thinned, I noticed. When the texts became polite instead of warm, I noticed that too. "How are you?" replaced, "Mom, you won't believe what happened." "Busy week" replaced laughter. I told myself not to be dramatic. Mothers are warned about this, how easy it is to make everything about ourselves. I went on with my days. I kept my routines. I watered the plants on the porch every morning, even the one that never quite thrived. I worked my part-time hours at the library, reshelving books and answering questions with the same steady voice I had always used. I cooked for one and froze leftovers I pretended I'd eat later. Still, something had shifted. It sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. The first real crack came on a Wednesday night, the kind of night that feels too long even before it's over. I had made soup, chicken, carrots, celery, nothing fancy. Lena used to say my soup tasted like safety. I laughed at that back then, told her it was just salt and patience. That night I ate it alone, the spoon clinking softly against the bowl. I decided to call her, not to accuse, just to hear her voice. She answered on the 4th ring. "Mom," she said, and there was a pause before the rest of the sentence. "Is everything okay?" That pause, I felt it like a thin blade. "I just wanted to check in," I said. "I haven't heard from you." "I've been busy," she replied quickly. Too quickly. "Work stuff, therapy, you know." Therapy. The word landed between us, heavy and unfamiliar. Lena had started seeing a therapist months earlier, something she mentioned casually, like a new gym membership. "I'm glad you're taking care of yourself," I said, and I meant it. There was another pause. I imagined her looking away, tucking her hair behind her ear the way she always did when she was deciding what to say. "Yeah," she said, "it's helping." Her voice was careful, like she was walking across thin ice. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. When we hung up, I stared at the phone again, the kitchen suddenly too quiet. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second announcing itself. I realized my hand was shaking. That was when the fear crept in, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet question I didn't want to ask. What is she being helped to believe? Before all this, my life had been simple in the way that only comes after you survived enough storms. I was a widow of 7 years. My husband, Thomas, had been a steady man, quiet humor, predictable habits, the kind who folded his socks the same way every time. Losing him had rearranged my life, but it hadn't emptied it. Lena and I leaned on each other then. We grieved differently, but together. I lived in the same house where I raised her, a modest place with creaky stairs and a porch that caught the afternoon sun. I kept things clean, not spotless. A home should look lived in, I believed that. Lena used to drop by unannounced, letting herself in with the spare key. She'd sit at the kitchen table and tell me about her day while I chopped onions or wiped counters. We didn't need to face each other to feel close. Those memories didn't vanish all at once. They faded like old photographs left in the light. The weeks that followed were filled with small rejections that were easy to excuse but hard to ignore. Calls not returned, invitations declined. When I suggested lunch, she said, maybe another time. When I asked if everything was okay between us, she said, of course, in a tone that suggested the question itself was the problem. I began to doubt my own instincts. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I had said something months ago that I didn't remember. Words can bruise without leaving marks. I replayed old conversations in my head while lying awake at night, the ceiling fan whispering overhead. I searched for moments where I might have failed her. Mothers are good at that, finding guilt where there may be only misunderstanding. Then came the envelope. It arrived on a rainy afternoon, the kind that feels like wet paper and old leaves. My name was written neatly on the front, not in Lena's handwriting. Inside was a letter from her therapist's office, an administrative mistake as it turned out, a scheduling error. Attached were notes that were never meant for me to see. I stood by the door, coat still on, rain tapping softly against the window. I told myself to put it down, to call and return it unopened, respect privacy. But something in me, a mother's instinct, or maybe just a woman who felt herself disappearing from her own story, opened the envelope. And in those pages, written in calm, professional language, I found a version of myself I barely recognized. I didn't read the notes all at once. At first, my eyes skimmed, catching phrases without meaning. Dates, abbreviations, clinical shorthand. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. I set my purse down slowly, as if sudden movement might make the words disappear. Client reports ongoing emotional distress related to maternal relationship. Maternal relationship. That was me, reduced to 2 words. I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope spread open like a wound. My chair creaked as I leaned forward, the familiar smell of lemon cleaner rising from the surface I had wiped only that morning. The notes were typed, tidy, impersonal. There was something unsettling about seeing your life summarized in bullet points. Client describes mother as emotionally controlling. I read that line 3 times. Emotionally controlling. The phrase echoed in my head, foreign and sharp. I tried to remember when I had last controlled anything. I hadn't chosen Lena's career. I hadn't chosen her husband. I hadn't even commented on the haircut she regretted 2 weeks later. My first instinct was to laugh. A small, disbelieving sound escaped my throat, then stopped abruptly when I realized my eyes were burning. Client feels guilt when asserting boundaries with mother. Boundaries. Another word that had entered our language quietly over the years, carrying weight it didn't used to have. I believed in boundaries. I respected them. Or at least, I thought I did. The rain softened, turning into a steady hush. I turned the page. Therapeutic goal. Help client reframe childhood experiences of invalidation. Invalidation? Childhood? I closed my eyes. Lena's childhood had not been perfect, no childhood is, but it had been full. Warm dinners, homework at the kitchen table, arguments, yes, but also apologies. I remembered sitting on the edge of her bed after a fight, smoothing her hair, telling her I was learning too. I remembered choosing my words carefully, knowing how deeply children listen even when they pretend not to. I wasn't a saint. I had been tired, sometimes impatient, sometimes afraid,
but invalidating her childhood felt like rewriting history with a cold hand. As I read on, a pattern emerged, story after story, filtered through a lens I didn't recognize. Moments I remembered differently were described as wounds. Advice I had offered was recorded as pressure. Concern was labeled manipulation. And beneath it all, a quiet suggestion that distance from me was not only healthy, but necessary. My hands trembled as I set the papers down. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, indifferent to my unraveling. I felt exposed, like someone had been watching my life from a corner I never knew existed, taking notes. I told myself to breathe, to be rational. These were Lena's feelings, not facts. Therapy is a place for untangling, not judging. I respected that, or I wanted to. But something else stirred beneath the respect, a grief that felt dangerously close to betrayal. I folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the envelope. I didn't cry then. Shock has a way of holding tears hostage. Instead, I made tea. My hands moved automatically, filling the kettle, waiting for the familiar click when it reached a boil. Steam rose, fogging my glasses. For a moment, I couldn't see anything clearly, and that felt right. That night, I barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, phrases floated up, detached from context, accusing without shouting. Emotionally controlling, invalidation, guilt. By morning, I had convinced myself of one thing. There had been a mistake. The notes were incomplete, or misunderstood, or written hastily. Surely Lena hadn't meant for me to be cast as the villain in her healing. I decided not to confront her right away. Mothers learn restraint the hard way. Instead, I waited for an opportunity, something natural, unforced. It came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, Lena invited me to coffee. The message was brief, polite. If you're free. I was free. I had always been free for her. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. It smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon pastries. Lena arrived late, her coat still damp, her hair pulled back tightly. She hugged me stiffly, like someone bracing for impact. We sat across from each other, a small round table between us. I noticed how she wrapped her hands around her cup, knuckles whitening, as if warmth alone wasn't enough. "How have you been?" she asked. "I've been okay," I said. "I was glad to hear from you." She nodded, eyes flicking away. Silence stretched, filled by the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. I chose my words carefully. "I received something in the mail by mistake." She had snapped up. "What?" "From your therapist's office," I said gently. "It wasn't meant for me." The color drained from her face. She set her cup down with a small clatter. "You read it," she said, not a question. "I did," I admitted. "I'm sorry, I should have sent it back, but—" my voice faltered. "I was worried." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms defensively. I recognized the posture immediately. She had done it as a teenager whenever she felt cornered. "Those were private," she said. "I know, and I respect your right to therapy. I'm not angry about that. I didn't recognize myself in those pages." Her jaw tightened. "That's because you never listened when I tried to tell you how I felt." The words hit harder than I expected. Listened. The accusation carried years with it. "I'm listening now," I said softly. She shook her head. "You always say that, but you hear what you want." Around us, cups clinked and chairs scraped. Life continued, oblivious to the quiet earthquake at our table. "What did I do, Lena? Please help me understand." She stared into her coffee, the surface trembling slightly. When she spoke, her voice was steady, rehearsed. My therapist helped me see that a lot of my anxiety comes from you, from growing up feeling like I could never disappoint you, like your approval was something I had to earn. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Denial rose instinctively, but I pushed it down. This was not the moment to defend. This was the moment to hear. I never wanted you to feel that way, I said. I know, but intentions don't erase impact. There it was, the language of therapy, precise and final. I understood it intellectually. Emotionally, it felt like standing on the edge of something collapsing. I need space, Mom, real space, to heal. That means fewer calls, fewer check-ins, no guilt when I don't respond. I nodded, as much as something inside me cracked. Space. The word sounded clean, harmless, like distance was a neutral thing. I can do that, I said, surprising myself how calm I sounded. She exhaled, relief flickering across her face. Thank you. We finished our coffee politely. When we parted, she hugged me again, still stiff, but longer this time. As I watched her walk away, her coat swinging slightly with each step, I felt an unfamiliar sensation settle in my chest. Not just loss, suspicion. Because healing should not require erasing someone else's humanity. And as I drove home, the envelope with the therapist's notes heavy in my bag, a question began to form, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. What if someone had been helping my daughter heal by teaching her to see me as the wound?
After that coffee, I did exactly what I promised. I stepped back. I didn't call on Sundays. I didn't send the photos I took of the first tomatoes ripening in the garden, even though Lena used to love seeing them. When something reminded me of her, a song on the radio, a sweater in a shop window, I let the thought pass without reaching for my phone. At first, the silence felt like discipline, a test of restraint. I told myself this was what love looked like now, holding space instead of filling it. But silence has a way of changing shape over time. What begins as respect can slowly harden into exile. Weeks passed, then months. Lena checked in occasionally, brief messages that read like updates you'd send a distant relative. Hope you're well. Busy week. Each time I responded with care, measuring every word as if it might be used against me later. I began to notice how much effort it took not to exist loudly in my own daughter's life. The ache settled into my routines. I felt it in small moments, standing in the grocery store, reaching automatically for her favorite cereal before remembering she wouldn't be there to eat it, folding a load of laundry and pausing with one of her old t-shirts still mixed in, soft from years of washing. At night, I lay awake listening to the house breathe. The pipes clicked softly, the refrigerator hummed. These sounds had always been comforting. Now they felt like witnesses. I kept returning to the notes, though I told myself I wouldn't. I read them the way one might study a map after getting lost, hoping to understand how I ended up so far from where I thought I was. What unsettled me most was not Lena's pain. Pain is real, even when it's misunderstood. What unsettled me was the certainty in the language, the way complexity had been flattened into conclusions. Mother prioritizes her emotional needs over client's autonomy. That line stuck with me. I tried to recall a single moment where I had done that consciously. I found none. What I did find were moments of fear, fear of her struggling, of her being hurt, of her believing she was alone. Was fear now a crime? One afternoon, while sorting old paperwork, I came across a folder labeled Lena School. Inside were report cards, art projects, notes from teachers. I sat on the floor and flipped through them slowly. In the margins of one report card, a teacher had written, "Lena thrives with encouragement." Encouragement. I smiled sadly. Somewhere along the way, encouragement had been rebranded as pressure.
The next turning point came unexpectedly, through someone else's mouth. It was my sister, Margaret, who said it first. We were sitting on her back porch, the late summer air heavy with the smell of cut grass. She poured iced tea into mismatched glasses, her movements deliberate, thoughtful. "You've been quiet lately," she said. I shrugged, just adjusting. She steadied me over the rim of her glass. Margaret has always been observant, the kind of woman who listens past words. "Lena?" I nodded. "She still in therapy?" "Yes." Margaret hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I hope this doesn't sound unkind, but sometimes therapists only hear one side of the story." I stiffened instinctively, then relaxed. It was the first time someone else had said what I had been afraid to think. "I know," I replied, "but it's her space. I don't want to interfere." Margaret set her glass down. "Interference isn't the same as defending yourself." That night, her words stuck with me. Defending yourself. The phrase felt foreign, almost inappropriate. Mothers are taught to absorb blame quietly, to apologize even when confused, to disappear if it helps their children feel whole. But what happens when your disappearance becomes part of someone else's narrative? I didn't want to fight Lena's healing. I wanted to understand it, and if possible, to protect myself from being slowly erased. The opportunity came through a small, almost accidental discovery. A week later, while checking my email, I noticed a message from Lena's therapist's office, this one addressed correctly, asking me to confirm receipt of the previously misdirected documents and requesting their return. At the bottom was a standard disclaimer followed by a name. Curiosity tugged at me. I searched the name online, not with malice, but with a need to ground this situation in something tangible. The therapist had a polished website, warm language, words like empowerment, reframing, release. She specialized in adult children of emotionally immature parents. That phrase made my stomach tighten. Emotionally immature. I read through her articles, each one describing a type of parent with increasing specificity. Controlling through concern, manipulative through sacrifice, smothering through love. The more I read, the more I recognized myself, not as I had lived, but as I could be interpreted by someone looking for patterns rather than people. I closed the browser, my chest tight. I realized then that this was not just about Lena pulling away. It was about a story being constructed, carefully, professionally, with all the authority of expertise. And in that story, I was not a complicated human being. I was a diagnosis. I decided I needed to speak, not to accuse, not to confront, but to offer my voice before it was completely overwritten. I wrote Lena a letter, not an email, a letter, handwritten, slow and deliberate. I told her I respected her healing. I told her I was proud of her for seeking help. I told her I was willing to listen to anything she needed to say, even if it hurt. And then I said something I had been afraid to admit. I am worried that I am being described in ways that do not reflect the whole truth. I am not asking you to defend me. I am asking you to remember me as a person, not a problem. I didn't send it right away. I read it over several times, removing anything that sounded defensive. When I finally sealed the envelope, my hands were steady. Dropping it in the mailbox felt like releasing a breath I had been holding for months. I didn't know how she would respond, or if she would respond at all, but for the first time since that missed call, I felt something shift, not in her, but in me. I was no longer willing to disappear quietly.
Lena didn't respond to the letter right away. Days passed, then a full week. I told myself not to watch the mailbox, but I did anyway. Each afternoon, I walked down the driveway, the gravel crunching under my shoes, and opened the metal door with a small, hopeful lift of my chest. Bills, flyers, nothing in her handwriting. The waiting became its own kind of conversation, one-sided, imagined. I rehearsed what I might say if she called. I rehearsed what I would not say. Silence teaches you restraint, but it also sharpens fear. When her response finally came, it wasn't a letter, it was a text. "We need to talk. Can we meet?" I read the message twice, then a third time, feeling my pulse quicken. I answered immediately. "Yes, anytime." We met at my house. That surprised me. She hadn't been inside in nearly a year. I cleaned the morning of her visit, though the house was already tidy. I wiped surfaces that didn't need wiping. I lit no candles, brewed no coffee. I wanted nothing to feel staged, just familiar. When her car pulled into the driveway, I watched from the window, my heart thudding softly. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before getting out, as if gathering courage. She looked around when she stepped inside, eyes lingering on the walls, the furniture, the small changes I had made. The house carried memories, whether we invited them or not. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same table where she had done homework, where we had shared meals and arguments and laughter. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching dust motes in the air. "I read your letter," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "Thank you for meeting me," I replied. She nodded. "My therapist thinks it's important that I stay firm in my boundaries." There it was again. Therapist thinks, not Lena thinks. "I understand," I said carefully. "I'm not here to cross any." She hesitated, then took a breath. But she also said that sometimes confronting the source can be part of healing. The word source stung more than I expected, like I was a spill to be cleaned up. "I want to be honest with you," Lena continued. "I've been remembering things differently lately. Stuff from when I was younger. Moments that didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't name them at the time." I nodded slowly. Memory changes as we grow. Sometimes we see old moments with new eyes. She frowned. "That sounds like you're minimizing." I held my hands up slightly, palms open. "I'm not trying to. I'm saying memory is complicated, for all of us." She looked unconvinced. "My therapist says children internalize things they can't articulate, that just because you didn't intend harm doesn't mean it didn't happen." "I agree," I said. "Impact matters." She seemed surprised by that. Her shoulders dropped just a fraction. "But," I continued gently, "I also believe context matters, and intent, and conversation." She looked down at the table, tracing the wood grain with her finger. "Sometimes it feels like every anxious thought I have leads back to you." That confession landed heavily between us. "I'm sorry you feel that way, truly, but I worry about a story where all roads lead to blame. That kind of story leaves no room for growth, yours or mine." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on pavement. "My therapist says this resistance is part of your pattern," she said finally. Resistance, pattern. The language had become armor. I took a slow breath. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Do you feel safer since you started pulling away from me? Not calmer, not more certain, safer." She opened her mouth, then closed it, her brow furrowed. "I feel justified," she said after a pause. The word echoed in my chest. Justified. Not healed. "Lena," I said quietly, "I will take responsibility for anything I did that hurt you, but I can't take responsibility for everything you're feeling now. Some of that belongs to life, to loss, to fear, to adulthood." Her eyes filled suddenly, tears gathering without spilling. "I don't know how to separate it." "I know, and that's hard." The conversation didn't end in resolution. There were no apologies that tied everything up neatly, but something shifted. Not a repair, more like a pause in demolition. Before she left, Lena stood in the doorway, hand on the frame. "I'm still going to therapy," she said. "I hope you do," I replied. She hesitated. "But I might ask my therapist some questions."
After she drove away, I sat alone at the table for a long time, listening to the house settle. I felt exhausted, but also strangely steady. The next development came weeks later, and it didn't come from Lena. It came from the therapist herself. I received a call one afternoon from an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Hello?" I said. "Is this Mrs. Harris?" a calm voice asked. "Yes." "This is Dr. Klein. I'm Lena's therapist." My grip tightened on the phone. "I wanted to speak with you briefly," she continued, "only if you're open to it." Open. The word carried weight. "I'm listening," I said. What followed was a careful, professional conversation. She explained that Lena had shared our recent meeting and that it had prompted some reflection in their sessions. "I want to clarify," Dr. Klein said, "that my role is not to assign blame, but to help my client make sense of her experiences." "I understand," I replied, "but experiences don't exist in isolation. They exist between people." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. "I think there may be room for a more nuanced exploration of your relationship." Nuanced. Another word, but this one felt like an opening, not a closing. When we hung up, I realized my hands were trembling not with fear, but with the release of it. For the first time in months, I felt seen, not as a label, not as a problem, but as a participant. I didn't know where this would lead. Healing is rarely linear, but I knew one thing with certainty. Silence had allowed my story to be rewritten. Speaking, carefully, imperfectly, had begun to give it back its depth.
After that call, something subtle but important changed. Not in the shape of my days, but in how I carried myself through them. I no longer felt like I was waiting to be judged. That didn't mean things were suddenly easy. Lena didn't rush back into my life with open arms. There were no long phone calls or spontaneous visits. But there was a shift in tone, a loosening of something tight and brittle between us. She texted more, still cautiously, still measured, but warmer. Once she sent a photo of a loaf of bread she'd baked and wrote, "I tried your recipe." I stared at that message for a long time before replying, my chest aching in a way that felt almost like gratitude. "I'm glad," I wrote back. "Did the crust crack the way it's supposed to?" "Not really," she answered, "but it tasted okay." I smiled at my phone. Imperfect, but real. A month later, she asked if I would consider attending one of her therapy sessions, with her permission, of course, and only if I felt comfortable. She framed it carefully, as if offering a fragile object. I said yes, not because I thought it would fix everything, but because refusing felt like returning to silence. The office was exactly what you'd expect: neutral colors, soft lighting, chairs arranged to avoid hierarchy. A box of tissues sat on the small table between us, like a quiet assumption. Lena sat stiffly at first, hands clasped. Dr. Klein greeted me politely, professionally. There was no hostility in her demeanor, only focus. "This session," she said, "is about shared understanding, not verdicts." I appreciated that. Lena spoke first. She talked about her anxiety, her need to untangle where certain feelings came from. She used the language she had learned: patterns, internalized pressure, emotional responses. I listened without interrupting, even when some words stung. When it was my turn, I didn't defend myself with a list of sacrifices or good intentions. I spoke instead about fear, how becoming a mother had cracked me open, how responsibility can sometimes disguise itself as control. I admitted where I might have pushed when I should have paused. I didn't always know how to step back, not because I wanted power, but because I was afraid of losing you, to the world, to mistakes, to pain I couldn't protect you from. Lena looked at me then, really looked. Her eyes softened, confusion giving way to something closer to recognition.
Dr. Klein asked careful questions, encouraging us to sit with discomfort rather than flee it. She acknowledged that some therapeutic frameworks can oversimplify complex relationships. Parents are not symbols. They are people with histories, limits, and their own unhealed places. That sentence felt like oxygen. By the end of the session, no one was healed, but no one was reduced either. In the weeks that followed, Lena and I began rebuilding, not the old relationship, but a new one with clearer boundaries, yes, but also clearer compassion. She called me one evening, voice tentative. "Can I ask you something without you taking it personally?" I laughed softly. "I can try." "Do you ever feel like therapy gives answers that are too neat?" I chose my words carefully. I think any tool can become a weapon if it's used to simplify instead of understand. She was quiet for a moment. "I think I needed someone to blame. It made things feel manageable." "I understand," I said. "Blame is lighter than grief." That conversation didn't make it into any therapist's notes, but it mattered more than any that did. I still think about those original pages sometimes, the ones that arrived by mistake. I keep them tucked away, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. Stories can be shaped without our consent. Silence invites interpretation. What I learned is this: healing that requires erasing another person's humanity is incomplete healing, and boundaries that demand someone's disappearance are not boundaries, they are walls. Lena and I are not perfect now. We misunderstand each other, we step wrong, but we speak, we ask, we pause before assuming. And sometimes, on Sundays, she calls again. Not every week, not out of obligation, just because she wants to hear my voice. The last time she did, she said something that stayed with me. "I don't think you were the villain," she said quietly. "I think you were human, and I was hurt. Both can be true." Yes, I thought. Both can be true. After that conversation, life didn't suddenly become lighter, but it became truer. There is a difference. Lena and I settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar but honest. We didn't go back to long, rambling phone calls about nothing. Instead, our conversations had shape, intention. Sometimes they were short, sometimes they were careful, but they were real. I learned to pause before offering advice. She learned to ask for it when she wanted it. That small shift alone changed the air between us. One afternoon, she came over unannounced. I heard her knock while I was folding laundry in the living room. For a moment, I just stood there, holding one of my own sweaters, heart racing like I was about to open the door to a stranger. When I opened it, she stood there with a grocery bag in her hand. "I made soup," she said, almost sheepish. "I don't know if it tastes like safety, but I tried." I stepped aside and let her in. The house seemed to recognize her immediately, settling around her presence the way it used to. She went straight to the kitchen, moving with a familiarity she hadn't lost, even if she thought she had. We ate quietly. The soup was too salty. She admitted it. We laughed. Later, sitting at the table with empty bowls between us, she spoke again. "My therapist said something last week that surprised me," she said. "What was that?" She said healing isn't about assigning permanent roles. It's about understanding movement, how people change over time. I nodded. That sounds closer to the truth. Lena traced a small circle on the table with her finger. "I think I needed to see you as static before, fixed. If you were frozen in the past, then my pain had a clear shape." "And now?" I asked. "And now," she said slowly, "I see you as someone who was doing the best she could with what she had. That doesn't erase my feelings, but it softens them." I felt tears rise then, quiet and unannounced. I didn't wipe them away. "I never needed you to erase anything. I just didn't want to disappear." She reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was warm, familiar, grounding. "I'm sorry I let that happen," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't always know how to step back," I replied. We didn't say more than that. We didn't need to. Over time, the consequences of those early therapy notes became clear, not as a public scandal or dramatic exposure, but as a quiet lesson. Lena began to question frameworks that demanded certainty too quickly. Dr. Klein adjusted her approach, inviting complexity instead of conclusions. No one was shamed, no one was defeated. What changed was the story. I was no longer the source. I was part of the context. And Lena was no longer just a wounded child. She was an adult woman learning how to hold both truth and compassion at the same time. As for me, I learned something just as important. I learned that dignity does not require silence. For a long time, I believed that being a good mother meant absorbing misunderstanding without protest, that love was proven through endurance, that speaking up would make me selfish. I was wrong. There is a way to speak that does not attack, a way to defend yourself without denying another person's pain, a way to remain human in a story that wants simple villains. Months later, I returned the envelope with the therapist's notes to the office, as requested. Before sealing it, I looked at those pages one last time. They no longer defined me. They were a snapshot, partial, imperfect, shaped by fear and language and timing. I slipped them inside, closed the flap, and felt something release in my chest. Life moved forward, as it always does. Lena and I now meet for coffee without tension buzzing beneath every word. Sometimes we talk about therapy, sometimes we don't. She still values her boundaries, I still respect them. But now, boundaries don't mean absence, they mean choice. And that has made all the difference.
I want to leave you with this thought. Sometimes the people we love most will rewrite our role in their lives, not out of cruelty, but out of pain. And sometimes professionals meant to guide healing will unintentionally sharpen that story into something rigid and unfair. If that happens to you, remember this. You are allowed to speak. You are allowed to be complex. You are allowed to exist beyond someone else's interpretation. Would you have stayed silent to protect the relationship, or would you have spoken up to protect your truth? Tell me in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, thank you for listening and for supporting this channel.